Lovely to see you all together this morning. And we've got another blessed day ahead of us. It's been a lovely time so far, hasn't it? Yeah. Despite my dry lips and my dry nose, that'll be the thing I will take back with me to US. It's quite a different heat to what I'm used to back in Michigan, which tends to be a lot wetter, you know. But I've had a blessed time here with you. And I just affirm God's working amongst you. You are a godly people, and I thank God for that. Let's start with some revision. The gospel of the kingdom. Without looking at your notes, right? Without looking at your notes, right? What's the first prominent truth we find in the gospel? Jesus is king. And many of the titles we read in the Gospels are essentially kingly titles. Not all of them, but most of them. Right? What was the second thing? Kings have kingdoms. Right? If he doesn't have a kingdom, he's not a king. And to be a follower of the king, you need to be part of the kingdom. Right? And then the third thing was, kings rule their kingdoms through their laws, right? So we're not setting up a law versus grace thing here when we read the Gospels. You're part of the kingdom and you expect the kingdom to run like a kingdom, right? And then number 4, when you're in trouble, kings save, laws don't. So you can see how we've got salvation through Christ while also maintaining the law under the kingdom umbrella. And then finally, we get our reality check. Kingdoms clash. So there is the framework pretty much for everything I've been trying to share with you. Jesus is king, kings have kingdoms. Kings rule their kingdoms through their laws. Kings save, laws don't. And kingdoms clash. We've been looking at going through the 5 roles that Jesus describes his followers in Matthew. Now, please bear in mind, I'm only sharing Matthew with you. Am I sharing with you all truth? No. You can't preach everything all the time, agreed? So I'm just giving you a slice of the New Testament, right? I'm not giving you Luke, I'm not giving you John, I'm giving you Matthew, right? So we had 5 roles. Do you remember what they were? Prophets. What was the next one we looked at? Righteous people. Today we're going to look at the third, which is the disciple. And then after our break, we're going to look at wise man, and then we're going to look at scribe. Would you believe it that the Lord describes his followers as scribes? I'm going to try and make sense of that. And really what I'm doing with you, okay, here comes the plug. I'm sharing material out of this book that I wrote. Now, I have in my bag 10 copies of this. And the price in rand is 400 rand. Not that I know what I'm going to do with the rand if you pay me in rand. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. Right? I'll probably put them in a drawer and forget about them. Right? But if you're interested, now this is written for non-Adventists, and it's an academic biblical studies book. So it's interacting to a degree, not overwhelmingly, with outside scholarship, and also with all your background sources, right? So I'm coming at it really from a historical point of view. But if you're interested, talk to me during one of the breaks. So, the prophet, what does the prophet do? Calls the nation back to God. What does the righteous person to do? Do you remember saving Sodom? We're trying to give them time to turn back to the Lord and protect them. Give them time for growth, right? But you need more than that. We need to go into a deeper relationship with the Lord. And this is where discipleship comes in. All of us are followers of Jesus. All of us. And then he's got these 5 roles. And I don't know whether one person is the disciple, one's this, one's that, or whether we're meant to be all of them. Right? That's a mystery when you read Matthew. Right? It's for us to respond to the text, I think. But discipleship, what its purpose is, if I'm reading the gospel correctly, it's to turn nominal followers of the king into committed followers of the king. You would agree with me that in South Africa, there's many people who say they're a Christian, but when you investigate closely, it's really surface level. Would you agree? Yeah, we call them nominal Christians, nominal followers of Jesus. And discipleship moves nominal followers of Jesus into committed followers of Jesus. Discipleship is not a church word, right? It's an education word, So, let's start, I'm going to skip through this, just by looking at some of the terminology. The followers of Jesus as disciples and Jesus as a teacher. Throughout the gospel, we have references to the followers of Jesus as, you can see the Greek there after the red word disciples, mathetai. It's one of those confusing words because it looks feminine, but it's actually masculine in Greek. Mathetai. Yeah, the ending is what we call first declension. Mathetai. I don't know whether we get the word maths out of this. I don't know. But mathetai is the very common word that we find all the way through the Gospel of Matthew. And it simply means a student. Right? If I describe you as a student, does that necessarily mean it's in church? No. This is just the common street level word for someone who is studying. Yeah? A pupil, a student. Right? Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and..." Now you can see make disciples. That is one verb, mathetoisate. It's an imperative. Go and make disciples of all nations. And how do you make them disciples? By baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. How many names do we have there? We have one name. It's the name of the Father, the name of the Son, and the name of the Holy Spirit. There's only one name, Yahweh. And there we have it, the name of the Lord, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's how we make disciples, and teaching them. And your Greek word is didaskontes. It's a participle. It's an ongoing action to obey everything that I've commanded you. Where would we find everything that I've commanded you? In the previous 27 chapters of Matthew, right? I partly wrote this book because I just it's okay to get annoyed every so often, isn't it? Right? Yeah? So it wasn't sort of deep annoyance, but I just got a bit frustrated because so often I would hear presenters, the purpose of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is the Gospel Commission. Do we agree with that? I think yes. When you come into the seminary where I teach, over the door, it's got 2 verses, one from Revelation 14 and then Matthew 28. Go ye therefore and make disciples. This is a really important verse for Adventists. It's like a mission statement. But usually when people explain this verse, right, they read it and then they just move on and they'll explain it with latest missiological theory. And I would suggest, if we're going to understand how to do all this education stuff, why not read chapters 1 to 27 of Matthew? It might just help. So we're going to look at this commission as the climax, it's chapter 28 of the previous 27 chapters. Okay, it seems logical. Okay? So, education language all the way through. Jesus is a teacher. This is Matthew 10. Notice how he's framing his relationship to his followers in educational terms. Matthew 10:24. A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher and the slave like the master. Who's the teacher he's referring to here? Himself. And he's characterizing his followers as students, disciples. Maybe we should call them students this morning, just to break out of the church way we've read this terminology. Matthew 26, as he's preparing for Passover, he instructs his disciples to go in and to prepare, and he says this, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher.'" Now, I've missed off the word "the." It should be "ha," which is the masculine "the," like D in Afrikaans. So it would be "di didaskalos," the teacher. Not a teacher, but the teacher. And scholars suggest that this is highly significant, because when you read the Old Testament, the prophets predict a time when the Lord will return to Israel, and when he returns, he himself will teach his people directly. He will be the teacher of his people. So here we have Jesus. In his mind, he understands his relationship to his followers as a teacher, not a teacher, but the teacher-student relationship. Okay? So hopefully we've seen that in Matthew, discipleship is one of the core themes. Now what we're going to try and do is unpack it. When I talked to you about the prophet and the righteous person, I placed those roles within their Old Testament background. What I'm going to do with teacher and student, I'm going to place it within its immediate historical context. I'm going to give you a historical reading of this. Yeah? Now, what I've learned is that wherever you go, people think their education system is the best in the world. Except a few South Africans who've talked to me since I've came there. You are unique, right? The number of people who've told me, "Oh, South African education," and I'm not going to belabor the point, but you know what I'm saying, right? But you go to Hungary, "Oh, our education is the best in the world," right? You go to England, they don't say it, but they know it, right? "Oh, yeah, they're too polite." Right? You go to America, "Yes, our education is the best in the world." The truth is, wherever you go, learning is difficult. Wherever you go, right? I tell my students, you're only here at the seminary because of your human nature. You're lazy, right? There's nothing stopping you buying all the books you're going to study at the seminary, buying them at home and reading them and self-educating. That's how Ellen White learned, wasn't it? Right? We've got her library at Andrews. You go there and you see she was a self-educated woman. Right? But most of us need a bit of motivation to educate ourselves. That's why we create these universities with penalties if you don't read and write and study. So it's because of the weakness of human nature that we need teachers. Right? So let me start with a little introduction to education in the ancient world. So, most girls learned the trade of their mothers. Whatever your mother did, you did if you were a girl, and whatever your father did, boys, that's what you did. So your father is a farmer, guess what you're going to be? A farmer, right? So that was the norm of education. It was simply imitating what your parents did for most people, right? There was no education system. Or state education system in the ancient world. Right. The nearest we get is in the Jewish system. They sort of had one, but the Romans didn't bother with one, the Greeks didn't bother with one. If you wanted education, you had to pay for it. It was private. Everything was private. Now, Do you know where the word school comes from? It comes from the Greek word scholazo, which means to educate, to have leisure time, right? When you're at school, I mean, this is what you're doing, right? You come in, and what do? You're not working out in the hot fields, are you? You come in, and you sit down, and you go, what's the teacher got for me today? Right, that's what you do when you go to school. I thought I was a professor until I started reading on this. And then I realized that the core of my job is that I'm an entertainer. Right? You didn't know that, but I am an entertainer. Right? You're all enjoying leisure time at this moment. And here I am, the jumping, whatever. I'm an entertainer. That's scholazo. You got leisure time. Yeah, I'm not going to put the boot in anymore, but there you go. Most couldn't afford private school over the age of 12, 13, 14. Most at that point left school and went into the occupation of their parents. So that's how it worked in the ancient world, right? If you could afford it, and now we're talking about the aristocrats, the elite, you would go to a college or a school of philosophy. And you know the most famous ones, Socrates. Heard of Socrates? Yeah. And you know who his two most famous students were? Plato and Xenophon. Right? And who was Plato's most famous student? Aristotle. And who was Aristotle's most famous student? Alexander the Great. Right? So that is higher level education. So we open our gospel, and how old was Peter and James and John and Andrew when the Lord, teacher, Rabbi Jesus, called them to study under him? How old were they? Were they children or were they adults? They were adults. So, you may not want to pay your money to come and study at the seminary at Andrews, right? But here is the cheapest university education you're ever going to get. Open your gospel and read it. And that's university level education. Right? You are watching adults being taught by a professor. Yeah? And how much does a Bible cost? Yeah? That's university education. Christianity has got this amazing capacity. I saw this as a pastor. You've got people who during their, Monday to Friday at work, in some jobs, your bosses don't want you to think. Right? Don't. Just do the job. Just do the job. Don't think. And then they come along on Sabbath, and it's like, let's meditate upon the divinity of the Creator. You know what Christianity does? It raises populations. That's what it does. Right? It's free university education. Now, I may be wrong on this, but I've never seen this, and I've read, so I'm trusting in one scholar. There was no such thing in the ancient world as children's literature. Right? We've got children's books today, haven't we? But in the ancient world, there was no such thing as children's literature. You went to school if you were a Greek, and from day one, you're studying Homer. You're studying, there's no such thing as children's literature. You're dealing with the cortex of your culture from day one. So, education in the ancient world. Just a little introduction. What I'm going to share with you, and this is more of a seminar than a sermon, but how did learning occur? Right? I know that the British style of university education is very different from the American style. So I'm just going to give you an introduction into how education actually occurred, now that I've given you an overview. And then we're going to look at what makes a good or a bad teacher. And then we'll finish what makes a good or bad student. So that's our agenda for this session. So, how did learning occur? Right. This is my summary from what I've read of ancient texts. right? I've tried to distill, right? So we've got teachers and students, And the teacher teaches through two modes, through words and through deeds. Through words and through deeds. And how it works is this, and this is rocket science, okay? So, the teacher speaks words. Told you it would get complicated, right? The teacher speaks the words, and what does the student do? Hears. Now, by hearing, we're not just, oh, it goes in one ear and goes out the other. To hear actually means to understand, biblically, right? So they hear, and then, after they've heard, and this is where our education is so different from ancient education, they memorize, and they memorize, and they memorize, and they memorize, and they memorize. So a philosopher would share their philosophy through their words, and the students would literally learn it off by heart. You can read of philosophers who in the morning would share their philosophy, and in the afternoon they would say, now students, second lesson. Do you remember what I taught you this morning? Now I'm going to put it into practice, and you need to watch how I live, and I need you to imitate me. So I will live out the deeds that express my philosophy, that express my teaching, and you are going to watch really carefully, and you are going to imitate me. What is the use of a philosophy if it can't be put into practice? You'd agree with me? I mean, we think of philosophers today as people who came up with bright ideas. The ancients didn't think of them like that. They thought of them as life coaches who taught people how to live good lives. Practical expression of their philosophy. So, let's just think a little about teachers speaking. Oh, gone the wrong way. I mean, just think of Jesus. He's described as a mighty prophet in Luke, in deed and word. You got the two things there, right? In his actions and in his words. Okay? So, a teacher speaks. What makes a good teacher is the ability to summarize complex material into short, pithy sayings. I mean, I've been doing it to you. I've tried to embody this in my own teaching, right? I teach a course, Discipleship in the Synoptic Gospels, and when I sort of prepared the course, I thought, why don't I teach it like an ancient rabbi would teach it and just see what happens? Right? When you read the Gospels, Jesus' sayings are short and sharp and to the point. Have you noticed that? He never waffles, right? Never. There's no redundancy. And the reason is that he has refined his teachings, and you can be sure he taught more than is in the Gospels, but he's refined it into, you are the light of the world. Okay, I get that. It's short and sharp. Right? A good teacher would prepare the student so that when the student wasn't with the teacher, the teachings of the teacher would still guide the behavior of the student. Right? So you're all my students, aren't you? Even though you haven't paid me. Right? You're still all my students, right? But you're going to go off home. Some of you naughty ones are going to go today. The good ones are going to stay till tomorrow, right? Right? So there's the definition of what a bad student is, right? When you go, Dr. Vine isn't going to be with you. No, he is. I'm in your head. Jesus is king. Kings have kingdoms. I've got in your head, I hope, right? Oh, I can't get Dr. Vine out my head. Right. So a teacher would synthesize their teachings, a large amount of teachings into short, pithy sayings, so that when the student is not with the teacher, what should I do? What would Paul do? Oh, he told me, right. 1 Thessalonians, Romans, many of Paul's epistles finish with short, sharp sayings, which you are meant to memorize, and every moment of the day, as you're walking through your day, you're meant to be guided by these. I mean, just read these. Rejoice always. You think you can remember that one? Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise the words of the prophets. Test everything. Hold fast to what is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Imagine you've memorized those and you're in your head as a parent. Oh, what should I do? Oh, what would Paul tell me? Which of those would you apply? That is a student shaped by the words of their teacher. Same with Jesus' words. We could go through this. Right? The teacher speaks and the student memorizes. Now, I mentioned to you that there is constant repetition. Have you noticed that the hardest teachings that Jesus shares, he has to repeat? What's the teaching that he repeats the most to the disciples? The Son of Man will be betrayed, handed over, killed, and on the third day. That was the hardest teaching. He had to repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it. So, when Jesus was walking with the disciples around Galilee, what were they discussing? A, the weather. B, the football results. C, come on, Peter, let's go through this again. We've done it a number of times, but you haven't quite got it. Repeat after me. What do you think he was doing? He was teaching them. That's what a teacher would do. These are sources from rabbinic sources. So really we're looking at maybe a generation or two after the New Testament. But just look at these. So this is a student, Rabbi Simon, repeated his Mishnah, his short saying, paragraph, 40 times before presenting himself before his teacher. 40 times. I need to go through this. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Here we've got another one. Ada would repeat his Mishnah teaching 24 times before coming to his rabbi. By the way, rabbi just means great one. My great one. Rav means great. Ravi, rabbi, is my. Okay, so a rabbi. I found one source in one book where the teacher had a student who wasn't the quickest student. And the teacher repeated the teaching for the student 400 times. Right? And the rabbis, right, they would spend their time constantly memorizing. Do you know how difficult that is? There's one account of a rabbi who was put into prison. And he couldn't see the sun, but he could tell the time of day because he knew, as he repeated from memory the Torah, where he would be at 9 o'clock, where he would be at 12 o'clock, where he would be. Right? That's how he could tell the time. Right? Memorizing, memorizing, memorizing. One rabbi couldn't remember a verse. And you know what his colleagues told him? They didn't say go back to university. They said go back to kindergarten school. Right? So, teacher speaks and the student hears and memorizes. Right? The teacher lives out their philosophy and the student imitates. So, here we have some sources outside of the Bible. Philo. He was a Jewish upper-class member of the elite of the Jewish community in Alexandria. Alexandria was the New York of its day. It was multicultural. Alexander built it. It's an incredible city if you read the history of Alexandria. It had a large population of Indians, large population of Jews, and he set it up so that you could follow your own religion. And if you follow your own religion, you follow your own rules. I mean, just imagine that. I come here as a Brit in America, and I follow American rules while I'm living in South Africa, right? So, quite a thing. And they were over 1 million Jews in Alexandria. And Philo's brother was the leader of that community. So he proposes Moses as the perfect king, perfect lawgiver, perfect. I just want you to know the problem is not with me. Right? Shall we go to this, gentlemen? Yeah. We've got Josephus portrays Moses as the perfect example of one who seeks to imitate. So Moses, great teacher, gives us a great example of what you should imitate. Do you know the Andrews commentaries that have come out, the 2 grey volumes? Have you seen those? The Andrews Bible commentary? Those are really worth buying. This is the day of my liberation because I might be able to take this off. So Paul, notice, this is educational language. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 6. In the Andrews commentary, I wrote the commentary on 1 Thessalonians. That's where I discovered how education worked in the ancient world. Right? It's got education language all the way through 1 Thessalonians. You became imitators of us and of the Lord, for in spite of persecution you received the word. So you can see you've got word and action. You're imitating and you're hearing. It's full of education imagery all the way through. If you guys want to know what it is to be a Christian, right, listen to what I'm saying, but more importantly, this is what I want you to do. Copy me. You want to live the Christian life? Imitate me. You see, you know what we've done? We've said discipleship is just the word and the knowledge. No. Good educators lived it out and invited people to imitate. Right? Oh, do you know how people respond? Oh, how could I say that? Isn't that arrogant? No. Oh, but my life isn't. Well, if it isn't, pull your socks up. Either this thing is totally transformational, or let's pack our bags and go home now. Be imitators of me. Now, it's not because I'm great, because who am I imitating like Paul? Yeah, I have my teacher, Christ. And I have to memorize his words. So, let's come to our second point. What makes a good teacher? And we're going to come back to the Gospel of Matthew. What makes a good teacher? So, Jesus identifies what a bad teacher. The scribes and the Pharisees, Matthew 23. This is not below the belt. I mean, this is just a fair assessment. He says, talking about the scribes and Pharisees, he says, let me read this. Do whatever the scribes and Pharisees teach you. So are their words good? Yeah, to a degree. And scholars wonder, well, how much of their words are good? And follow it, so follow their words, but do not do as they do. Why? For they do not practice what they teach. That is a classic condemnation of the bad teacher. Their words, good. Their actions don't match. Right? You can see this is educational imagery. You've got the deeds and the words. They need to align. And with these guys, It doesn't. They're imperfect, what we call exemplar figures, who should at best be heard, but not imitated. Right? So that raises the question, is Jesus a good teacher? Right. I shared with you, do you remember on, was it Thursday, Friday? When I first introduced Matthew, we started off with the 5 discourses. When Jesus had finished these sayings, Do you remember that? Yeah. 5 teaching blocks, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 to 7, witnessing, chapter 10. I preached yesterday on Matthew 13, the 7 parables, community rules, chapter 18, warnings to the nations, the future, prophecy in Matthew 24 and 25. 5 teaching sections. So are those the words or the deeds of Jesus? Those are the words of Jesus. And we are invited, as we read the gospel, to compare those 5 sections with the sections in between, where Jesus does his actions. And what would we hope to find? That his words and deeds match. And if they do, we come to the conclusion that Jesus is a consistent, trustworthy teacher. Are you with me? Yeah. So now I apologize for this, right? But essentially what I'm doing is giving you it's taken me 20 years of study on Matthew, right? So I'm giving you something that's going to take you at least 5 years, if not 10, to really get to the bottom of it, right? Because what you've got to do, let me go back, you've got to, 5 to 7, Sermon on the Mount. What's the first thing a student does? Hears and memorizes. So you've got to memorize it. Now, I'm not very good at that. I'm a bad student. But you've got to memorize it. Same with chapter 10, same with chapter 13, same with chapter 18. So first thing is, we've got to memorize it. And then we've got to look at the sections in between. And as we look at those stories, we've got to ask, does Jesus put into practice his words? Or is he like the Pharisees, where his actions don't match his words? And you might start with the Sermon on the Mount and then read through the rest of the gospel, looking to see where it's put into practice. Or you might start with chapter 10, the witnessing, and then look and see where it is in the rest of the gospel. You might look at chapters 24 and 25 and then see how those themes are everywhere in the gospel. It's a fascinating way of reading. And as you do this, the values of the text are going deeper and deeper and deeper into your mind. One of my colleagues at Andrews, German, well, actually, he did his PhD in Holland, in Netherlands, right? He shared with me that when you have to memorize the text, it changes the relationship of the Bible to the reader. You see, what we do, we just, Sabbath school, can we read this text? And we quickly go there, we read it, and then we move on, don't we? And then very quickly, we're just discussing what it means. Oh, I think it means this. I think it means that. Oh, I think it means this. Thank you, sister. Thank you, brother. Oh, no, I think it means this. And we get blah, 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 blah. All our ideas coming out. Imagine you have to memorize it. You have a lot less time to discuss it. Now, the text is dominating your mind. You've literally, I've got to memorize all of this. I have to keep going through it, keep going through it, keep going through it. Those values change your mental narrative. That's what's happening. You are literally reprogramming your brain as you do that. And it's changing which is more important, the critic or the word? The word. So this is where memorization comes in. Right? You're memorizing it. Oh my goodness. I'm memorizing this word and it's dominating me. Rather, I'm the critic telling you what I think it means. It changes your relationship to the text. So consistency. So we can go through Jesus' teachings on the left-hand side, and then we can look at the deeds on the right and see whether Jesus puts into practice what he tells others to do. Right? If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Was Jesus rejected? Yes, he was. In chapters 11 and 12. So what he does in chapters 14 and 15, he literally brushes the dust off his feet, and he goes away from the cities of Galilee. I wrote an academic article on this. It's got a really catchy title, Exodus Allusions in the Midsection of the Gospel of Matthew. Right, that's a really catchy title, isn't it? Right? But it says on the tin what it's doing, right? Read the label. Yeah? Exodus allusions in the midsection of the Gospel of Matthew. Right? You can go online and you can find it with Tyndale Bulletin. And my argument is, chapter 14, 15, 16, Jesus literally is doing what he tells his disciples to do. He's leaving the cities. He's out in the wilderness, and he has to feed the 5,000. He's out in the wilderness. He has to feed the 4,000. He goes to the region of Caesarea Philippi. He goes to the region. It's always the region, never the city, in those verses. He's avoiding the cities because they've rejected him. He's putting into practice his own words. He is a consistent teacher who lives out his own philosophy. Right? And we could go on. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings before me as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. Guess what happens to Jesus? He goes through that very same experience. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And do you remember what his mother and brothers did? They came to him to try and drag him out. Right? He loved his father's will over that of his family. Right? So just 3 examples. So how do you teach? Through your word and through your deed. What makes a good teacher? They match. What makes a bad teacher? They don't match. I haven't got time to convince you if you're undecided this morning. I've just given you 2 or 3 examples. But if you are interested to find out whether you can trust Jesus, you need to do some deep study. And you need to check his words, and then you need to check whether he's consistent. And I would suggest that he is a good teacher. So, let's move on to our final point. What makes... maybe I should just point this out. Discipleship. I'm a bad teacher. I was a better teacher at Newbold than I am at the seminary. Because at the seminary, I have so many students, right? Too many of them. Did you know the seminary is it's in the top 10 largest religious or theological institutions in the US, right? At the seminary, we have around about 1,100 students. We're one of the big boys in North American religious education, right? And so I can have classes up to 50, 60 students. So that's quite a lot to teach, right? And I don't remember their names. I had one student who came to Sabbath lunch, and I sort of looked at him. And then he told me he'd done a load of classes with me. Yeah, bad teacher. But for this to work, for students to imitate your life, what do you need to do? You need to share your life with them. A good teacher lives with their students. Right? You know, it's why when you're a pastor, you don't just go to church, preach, and then run away from church, do you? You spend time. You spend time. That's where the education is going on. Outside of the pulpit. That's where you teach. You share the word from the pulpit and then you spend time. Right? That's why Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, I shared my life with you. So, what makes a good student, right? A good student is someone who memorizes and imitates. Now, what I'm going to do is just to show you how some of the stories in Matthew function, right? They function as bad examples of people who don't put into effect the words of Jesus. We've got the story here of Herod killing John the Baptist. Now, this is not just a historical story. This is a story of actions which you need to relate to the words of Jesus. So, if you've got your Bibles, open it. I'm going to read, and as I read, I did ask you, I gave you some homework. Do you remember what the homework was? To read the Sermon on the Mount, right? So, if you've done your homework, this will make sense, right? So, we go to Matthew 14, and as I read this passage, you think, what themes in this story are popping up from the Sermon on the Mount? Does that make sense? What themes do we have in this story from the Sermon on the Mount? Chapter 14, verses 1, reading. At that time, Herod the ruler heard reports about Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. For this reason, these powers are at work in him." For Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been telling him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Though Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd, because they regarded him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company, and she pleased Herod so much that he promised on oath to grant her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." The king was grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison. The head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who brought it to her mother. His disciples came and took the body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. What themes do we have in this story from the Sermon on the Mount? Anyone? Okay, we have someone humble in John the Baptist. Yes, very good. What other themes do we have? A persecuted what? Prophet. Did Jesus talk about persecuted prophets in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he did in chapter 5. What else have we got? Adultery. Did Jesus preach about adultery in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he did. Here it pops up. What else have we got? Okay, we've got murder. Does Jesus talk about murder in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he does. What does Herod do when he sees the dance? What does he do at that point? He makes a vow, an oath. Does Jesus talk about oaths in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he does. Yes, he does. You know, you read this story in light of the rest of the gospel, and there's almost nothing that happens in this story which isn't related to the Sermon on the Mount. He commits adultery. Do you think there was a little bit of lust going on there? Maybe. Yeah, I think it's a plausible suggestion. He wants to commit murder. We've got someone who wants to commit murder. He makes a promise on oath. Read chapter 5, verse 34. Jesus says, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." He persecutes a prophet. When I read that in light of the Sermon on the Mount, imagine you memorize the Sermon on the Mount and then you read the rest of the Gospel. Everything else in the Sermon on the Gospel is unpacking the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? Time is against us. Rich young man. Yeah, we're not going to read it. I just have 2 minutes left. If you read the rich young man who comes to Jesus, you remember that story? Yeah? He keeps the commandments of God, agreed? Yeah. And then we're given all the commandments. Well, lo and behold, those are the commandments Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. Does Jesus talk about wealth in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes, he does. He says, do not worry like the Gentiles, what you will eat and what you will wear. This guy does worry. Jesus tells him, store up your treasure in heaven. Do we get that in the Sermon on the Mount? Yes. Can you see what I'm showing you? Is that basically the whole gospel is an integrated whole. Is that you read these stories and you think, oh, that's just no. That is a teaching moment of somebody who is either following the words of Jesus or not following the words of Jesus. You're seeing the consequences of bad discipleship. Now, do you find, we could go on. If we had time, we could look at Matthew 23. Yeah? You blind fools. Does Jesus talk about fools? Yes. Yeah? They swear by the sanctuary. No, you shouldn't be doing that. Matthew 5. They keep every letter and stroke of the law, but neglect the essence. They have poor judgment. Yeah? They swallow gnats and camels. They practice piety before others in order to be seen by them. Go and read chapter 6, verse 1. He describes them as hypocrites. All the way through chapter 23, well, that's there in Matthew 6, 2, 5, and 16. Okay? So, here you have education. How have I described it? What are the two ways teachers taught? Through their words and through their deeds. And what does the student do? Hears, memorizes, and imitates. So we are moving from the nominal follower of Jesus to someone whose mind is now dominated by his words and whose actions are lived in imitation of him. Right? Now, I am just going to read one more thing. Right? Because I think this is an educational parable. Some of the parables are righteous persons. Parables, we've looked at some of those on Friday. Some of them are wise man parables. We're going to look at one or two this morning. Here is maybe an education parable. The parable of the talents. The talents. Now, growing up, I was told, your talent is to play the piano. Now, I can tell you, it's not one of my talents, right? And you don't know, well, I didn't feel guilty, and that was the problem. I had this music teacher who'd say, after a long day at school, go home and relax in front of the piano. And I thought, this guy isn't on planet Earth, right? My relaxation of school is playing football and cricket. That was my relaxation. I've been indoors all day, now I need a break, right? Talents, it's not, your personal capacity. What is the one thing that Jesus leaves his followers after his death and resurrection? What's the one thing he leaves? In the Gospel Commission, he says, go out and baptize them and teach them what? All things. The one thing Jesus leaves his disciples with after he leaves them is his teachings. Right? For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. I think Jesus is describing his own experience there. He's going to be leaving soon. He entrusts his property. What has he given us? His teachings and the traditions about him. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And you know the story, right? What do the good servants do with the talents? They multiply them. You take the words of Jesus and you live them out in your life and you multiply them into every area of your life. Whatever your profession is, you're pushing the teachings of Jesus through your behavior out into that profession. The rabbis expected their students to develop their teachings. Does Paul develop Jesus' teachings? Yes, he does. He's a good student. He's taking the talents and he's multiplying them. You take the teachings of Jesus and you multiply them either by developing them, more words, or by living them out. That's your other way. What is the bad student? What's the bad? The bad servant. He takes the talent and buries it and does nothing with it. Right? Just leaves it there. He knows where it is, so he knows it. Just never puts it into practice. Never multiplies it. Yeah? So, let's summarize. Discipleship requires memorization and intentional actions. Agreed? That's the basic. Discipleship requires lives lived in close contact. It requires us to be role models. It's a slow process. Right, you just think, it's Jesus 1 with 12 or 1 with 3. Yeah? To share your life with someone, there's only a certain number of people you can do it intensively with. Right? It's a slow process. Discipleship guards against nominal Christianity. Right? When his words dwell within us, our thought world changes. In Matthew's terms, in Jesus' terms in the Sermon on the Mount, right, he talks about us as trees. Right? What we're doing, we're turning the bad trees into good trees. That's what we're doing. We're changing from inside out. We're changing the narrative. And if we change the internal narrative, good trees produce what? Good fruit. When our thought world changes, our deeds change. Good trees produce good fruit. So, there is my little introduction to discipleship, to education in the ancient world. And my invitation is, my warning is, this is going to take you a lifetime. Right? The beauty of Christianity is that you never get to the end of it. Yeah, that's what I like about it. Right? You've literally got a life journey ahead of you of growing closer and closer to your teacher. My invitation is to stay close to him, listen, memorize, and imitate.